Mary Pickford was a film pioneer, and it's also fair to say that she was a feminist icon. Most of her filmography doesn't resonate with modern audiences, but she was her own producer for a lot of her career, back in a time when most actors weren't, and certainly most actresses weren't. Powerful woman. Rich and powerful or not, though, the co-owner of Pickfair would have loved to live long enough to buy stuff from our sponsor. And that sponsor is, drumroll please, oh, no drums, Sparkplug Coffee. Sparkplug sports the freshest, fairly traded, premium Arabica beans in Canada. We Canadians and our American neighbors will get orders sent within a week, and us great white North types won't even owe 1 red cent for the shipping costs. Or 1 black and white cent, because this is a black and white movie. You can nab decaf or half calf, in addition to those loaded to the brim calves. Plus, Sparkplug has a wide assortment of blends and roasts. Roasts, those S's, man. Do you like the option of different seasonal blends? Well, you're in luck, because Sparkplug gives you the chance to shake things up and sip something that makes more sense here in March, perhaps something Irish for St. Patty's Day, than what you were drinking back in the summer. Join Sparkplug's Autopilot Coffee Club, and then your membership in that can score you some serious deals and perks. You members also save money on every order, and you can customize to get your orders when it suits you. This is not a Coffee of the Month club that just ships you stuff whether you want to offer some to your many suitors or not. The browser address is sparkplug.coffee. Add /HYES, and that'll allow you to save 20% off your next order. Our HYES promo code is the key to keeping some dollars in your pocket, you Southern belles. Okay, that'll do it for the promoting section. It's time for the reviewing section. And action. Have you ever seen Coquette? Hello, film friendlies, and thank you for listening to the 574th podcast that can be found on this channel. Just like Horse Feathers a few months ago, I didn't even promote that I'd be covering this flick today. It's a surprise episode here on Have You Ever Seen, and it's a movie I chose mostly so I can get at least one Mary Pickford film on this channel. I wasn't exactly excited to cover this, but I gotta tell you right off the bat that I enjoyed it more than I expected to. Plus it was available on YouTube for free. My name is Ryan Ellis, the man who's most decidedly not coquettish, nor am I bro-kettish. I'll be spoiling this picture today, and I'll be talking about it alone. My wife Bev doesn't podcast on Fridays. When I jaw about a flick by myself, I talk about the plot in sequential order, I crack a few jokes, and engage in the odd helping of tomfoolery. I also ask reasonably good questions from time to time. This filmic extravaganza doesn't have a lot of facts and figures to share before we talk about the plot, but let's set up what there is to highlight. So, Coquette, a drama of the American South, was released by United Artists 95 years ago on April 6th, 1929. Pickford helped found UA 10 years before this with Charlie Chaplin, D.W. Griffith, and with her husband Douglas Fairbanks. More on the studio later on. The 100% talking picture pulled in about 1.5 million smackers, which is pretty great for a movie that came out 95 years ago. That popularity isn't reflected by the Rotten Tomatoes reviews, which are about as bad as it gets for a film we've chosen to review. Coquette only gets a 44% rating from the critics and just 25% from the audiences. The critics' average is a putrid 3.3 out of 10, although only 9 people have reviewed it on that site, which means only 6 critics there said they didn't like it. Only 6. It's funny to think, actually, that one of the biggest names in cinema history, at least in the early days of the film biz, has only had about a half dozen of her feature films reviewed by critics on Rotten Tomatoes. This is the only rotten review for her, though. The other ones have scores in the 80s and 90s, and one of them was even 100%, I think. I guess people just aren't going back and taking another look at Mary's work, or they're at least not really reviewing it when they do watch her old movies. The only thing in the awards section for this movie is that Mary Pickford won her one and only Oscar for this role, and it was her only nomination, too. The Academy gave her an honorary award in 1976 for her unique contributions to the film industry and the development of film as an artistic medium. Mary was in her mid-80s at the time and wasn't at the show that night to claim the bauble. I think she was not well. Interestingly, her honorary award was the same year that Cuckoo's Nest won 5 trophies, including Jack Nicholson winning for Best Actor for the first time. And he paid tribute to Pickford about how she was one of the first to get a percentage of her movie's grosses when he did his speech. I guess the presentation with her had just happened because he gestures to the screen over the stage when he mentions her name. And I don't know if Jack got a lot of bucks for Cuckoo's Nest, which was a monster at the box office, but I know he got paid the GDP of a small country for Batman, so I guess he has Pickford to at least partially thank for that, although I don't think they made toys and other merch from her movies. She didn't dance with the devil in the pale moonlight. I always ask that of all my prey. I just like the sound of it. Her United Artists colleagues had already been feted with trophies before Mary was. Chaplin got his own, what a surprise, right? Chaplin got his own honorary award 4 years earlier in 1972. Another phrase for me is tough. Honorary award. Say it slower, Ryan. Fairbanks was given a, hey, you're great, so we're honoring you trophy way back in 1940. And Griffith beat all of them to the punch because he was honored by the Academy in 1936, about 20 years after his monstrous successes with Birth of a Racist and Intolerance. Coquette wasn't on any American Film Institute lists or even nominated for any. The movie's not in the National Film Registry either, although on that note, let's start talking about the story because we begin with a graphic that says, the film has been restored by the Library of Congress Motion Picture Conservation Center in Dayton, Ohio. That's on a card at the beginning of the film. So it's not in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., but somebody's preserving it in Dayton, Ohio. Although this print on YouTube was not very good, I can't expect a 95-year-old movie to glisten on our brand new TV, although at least the sound wasn't all that bad, considering this was so early in the sound era. I happened to see The Wild Party the day after I saw this. That's a Clara Bow comedy that came out the same year. It was the reverse. The print wasn't all that bad, but the sound was wonky, often terrible. Okay, so the plot of Coquette. Jimmy, who's the punk brother of the character that Pickford plays, gets in his black maid Julia's face, but she isn't really having it. I love that Louise Beavers also isn't saying, "Yasu," and acting like a buffoon here. She's got quite a bit of dignity in this movie. Matt Moore as Stanley comes calling to see Norma Besant? I don't recall how they said the last name, but B-E-S-A-N-T. Besant? I don't know. Mary Pickford plays her, of course. The Pick was in her 30s, but she has the voice of a child. I wrote that while watching the film, then discovered later on that she apparently felt the same way. She thought she sounded 12 or 13. I'd say even younger, at least sometimes. I guess sometimes she sounds a little more womanly. Anyway, Stanley apparently has told her he loves her 4,572 times. I'm quoting him, and he even gets a little kiss. But based on the title of the movie, we know she isn't sweet only on him. She's got thousands of kisses, probably more than 4,572, to dole out to other gentlemen callers. The second billed actor in the movie, John Mac Brown, shows up next. Michael here glowers at Stanley, who quickly leaves. He knows when a tougher man doesn't want him around. Michael can't afford to buy a dress shirt to wear to the big dance, so he tells Norma he won't be two-stepping with her, which she pouts about. I guess Norma always gets what she wants. She does tell the micer that she's happy that he thrashed a guy who called her a silly little coquette, though. I looked up what coquette actually means, and the online dictionary says it's a flirt, a girl or a woman who knows how to flatter and manipulate men with her charms in order to get what she wants. So maybe you can call me a coquette. Now, I figured that was the gist of it, but there we are. Now we know. You'd think Pickford would be way more of a tease than she actually is in this movie, based on that definition. But we're looking at the man she's going to love throughout the story, and we can see that already. So maybe the flick doesn't have the most accurate title, or she was a coquette before the story started. Anyway, Stanley comes back because he's zooey for the girl who will never be his, and he offers to drive her and Michael to the the dance. But Norma says she's not going after all. No Michael, no Norma. She and Mike sit down on the couch and talk, with the light slowly dimming until they're almost completely in the dark. I guess this is supposed to suggest they sat there and talked for, an hour or more, as the sun was setting? At first I thought it was a mistake, then I came to appreciate what they're trying to do with the lighting in this scene. I don't know if it truly worked, but Sam Taylor and his team, the director if I didn't say already, I appreciate the effort. Daddy Dr. John comes in and snaps the lights on. He's not a Michael guy, and he isn't impressed that this fellow got into a brawl earlier that day. He also prefers Stanley as a potential husband for his daughter. He may be dull, but Pops likes that he's going to be a doctor, and he can provide for Norma better than the blue-collar guy can. But then Norma up and tells her beau that she loves him, even more than she loves her daddy. He's going off to work for a few months to prove he can provide for a rich man's daughter, even if that rich man clearly will never accept him. But when he comes back, those wedding bells are gonna bong. Norma helpfully holds up an invitation to the camera to show us that the card advertises the summer dance at the Sunnydale Country Club on June 16th, 1928. Very specific. I'm betting that's the literal time they shot this movie. She rips up that card, which dissolves to a shot of a card that advertises the Autumn Dance, which is on September 18th, 1928. I thought that was a clever touch to show the passage of time by Sam Taylor, and if there was any doubt if this is a contemporary film, now there can't be. The dance is a rowdy affair. People bop around similar to how they do during the Charleston dance sequence in It's a Wonderful Life. Right before the floor opens up, courtesy of Alfalfa, and Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed end up falling in the pool. Young guys fight over who's going to dance with Norma, so she says nuts to you guys, those buffoons, and ends up briefly in Stanley's arms. They go out to the veranda to talk for a bit, but then one of those fighting punks drags her in to dance with him. Although Stanley comes back inside to get a few more seconds with Norma on the dance floor before she sees Michael lurking outside. Michael, motorcycle, has come down from the hills just to see his lady. Come down from the hills. What's that song? Run to the hills? She didn't give him a big smooch when they were last together, but she does this time. I'm a little bit surprised this wasn't a nominee for AFI's Top 100 Passions. The scene is pretty hungry, and they both play the "Ooh, I want you and I do know I need you" quite well. Plus the whole concept of this film is that one woman is flirty with all kinds of men. That seems pretty passionate. Anyway, Norma and Michael have taken off, but Stanley and some other friends try to find out where they went, or at least where she went, and they come up empty. Morning comes, we find out that Norma's brother Jimmy was at the dance until 4 a.m. and gets some grief from Pops about it, but he's a boy, so it ends up being a case of, you're going to be a man now. If he found out about Norma being out that late in this very same scene, I don't think it would be, well, you're going to be a woman now. Michael shows up and reveals to his ladylove that a few hunters saw them leave Michael's mother's cabin at 4 in the morning. Rumors are going to swirl about this one, even though she claims they just sat up talking. She ends up mooning over Michael, telling him how much she loves him, when in walks dear old daddy. He's in a glowering mood, but he does agree to have a word with his possible future son-in-law, and it's not a good word. Dr. John wants Michael out of his house, partly because both youngsters agreed that they wouldn't see each other again, and they lied. Those low-down, non-Yankee liars. One of the greatest quotes of all time in Shane. You're a low-down Yankee liar. He doesn't sound like that. Voice cracked a little bit there. Much like Mary Pickford in this movie. Both guys get into clenched fist mode, and hey, credit the actors for putting across how angry they are. I've seen better actors do a worse job of selling rage. And this is before Michael reveals that they were in the cabin until 4 a.m. The doctor didn't know that bit of information, especially when Mike implies they got to bumping. This is turning into Dirty Dancing. Mike's like the wind up the hill. He loves Norma. Our weepy little Coquette ends up literally, crying on the maid Julia's shoulder, who sympathetically calls her a little baby. If you call a young person things like that, they probably won't grow up too fast. Norma tells the Jules about her plans for the future with Mikey Mike, which mostly serves to remind me again just how high-pitched Mary Pickford's voice often is in this movie. She sounds like John Gilbert, only she's probably a little bit deeper than he was. I didn't mention that Pops went off after Michael with a gun in his hand. Stanley comes back to the house at this point and announces that her father continued the argument with her intended, and it went sour. These are Americans, so it seems inevitable that somebody would get shot when tempers are flaring this much. And Michael is the one with a hole in him that wasn't there before. Stan tells Norma that Mike might not be dead yet, but the wound, it's fatal. She sprints off to see Michael before he kicks it, and she does get to speak to him for a bit. They talk gleefully about a future they'll never have and exchange I love yous before they kiss, and he dies. She can't accept it and gets a little screechy, but I have to say that I've seen actors play pain and disbelief over the death of a loved one worse than this. It's a fairly believable piece of acting on Pickford's part. Stanley, Julia, and Jimmy try to comfort her, but it's no use. It's only been a few minutes since her boyfriend stopped breathing, but the doctor's lawyer friend bursts in and demands that she control herself. If she doesn't, then her father might end up in prison, which is, of course, where he belongs. The lawyer tries his best to convince her to lie to save dear old Dad, and Norma does stop crying, but she sets her jaw. Pops killed the man she loved, so hang him high. Now, Michael was a poor man and the doctor is rich, plus the spin here will be that Michael dishonored Norma because they got intimate when they weren't married, so offing him was justified. But I was guessing that justice will not be served and Norma's daddy would just flat out get away with this. But 3 months have passed, according to Jimmy, and the two kids lament about how Pops is still in the hoosegow and his murder trial is ongoing. Well, she's not lamenting as much as her brother is. She says she's forgiven him for what he did. What? She has? But he won't forgive her. So yeah, the trial isn't going well for Dr. Baton, whatever. Michael was a right decent fellow, and people know he had a plan to make enough money to marry Norma, so it's a pretty flimsy argument that the doc was defending his daughter's good name. We learn when Norma gets her turn on the witness stand that her mother has been dead for 12 years. Did the doctor gun her down too? This is the South. Maybe she looked askance at a black man or something, almost as inexcusable as that. Anyway, Norma tries to help her dad by lying about the nature of her relationship with Michael, so it'll look like the old man was right to murder somebody who might have touched the young woman in a lusty way. You know, justice. But the ruse doesn't work because the prosecutor gets in her face, literally. His nose is only about 6 inches away from hers when she's sitting in the witness chair, and he breaks her down. She confesses that Michael made love to her, which back in the days of old-timey movies usually didn't mean what you think it does. I've heard that phrase in a lot of movies back in this era, and even later than this, the 40s and so on, and I think the idea is supposed to be that they just talked and kissed and maybe hugged, but not that. This flick was made before the production code got all censory on Hollywood, But I think even at this point, movies weren't having their characters talk explicitly about taking off clothes and introducing each other to their body parts. Studios were actually pretty good about self-policing before the Hays Code started being so strict and unreasonable in the early 30s. And if you look back at the things that they stopped, it was often almost nudity or flat-out nudity that was being allowed on screen. I guess brutal violence, I don't remember that so much. But language, how could there be much language when it was still the silent era, only a couple years before this? You're not going to have the F word on a title card. I don't think. Maybe they did in some cases. Well, anyway, she breaks down on the stand and can't keep lying about how much she didn't love the mic machine, because she did. Her dad realizes this, and even though he's accused of murder, is allowed to get up from his chair and take his daughter in his arms, also doing what actors back then always did, grab a woman by her biceps and squeeze very hard while lecturing them, or sometimes kissing them, or what have you, in this case, lecturing. Anyway, he says that she means more to him than his own life does, and he wants her to stop fibbing about what happened. He took an innocent life, and he's ready to pay the price. He spots a gun sitting on the evidence table, the one he used to pop a shot into Michael's body, and then he gets one last hug and kiss from the weepy star of this movie before standing up, strolling over to the judge and telling him that his daughter wants to retract her testimony. He flat out admits he killed an innocent man and says he will pay his debts. A Lannister always pays their debts, which he does by grabbing the gun off screen and blasting himself with it. We never see any of this. We only see Pickford's reaction. She's not as traumatized when seeing her own father shoot himself as she should be. This isn't one of the best acting moments in the film. I complimented her a few minutes ago, but this is not the greatest scene on her part. Now that the accused is no longer breathing, the trial is just about over. Okay, it's over. Stanley waits around for Norma, planning to take her home. She seems to have recovered pretty well from her father gunning himself down. Stan says he'll always be there for her, no matter how long it takes. But she wants to walk home alone and help Jimmy with his algebra. I guess she's the man of the house now, and the head mathematician. It's not like she and Jimmy are little kids, but this is tough stuff, to have to live the rest of your lives with both parents in the grave. I'm 50 years old, and I'm glad to at least still have my mom around. Our melodrama ends with Norma walking off down the street on her own. I bet she'll be back on her coquettish feet in at least a few hours. She's a fast healer in matters of the heart. Or some might say she's a tough southern dame, and after all, tomorrow is another day. I hate that quote so much. It's such a stupid quote. Gone with the Wind is 10 years later. So, the cast. Mary Pickford was born right here in Toronto. My fellow Southern Ontarian went on to become one of the biggest stars of her era, but the filmography of the lady born Gladys Smith isn't as juicy as you might expect. Two of her best-known titles are Pollyanna and Sparrows, both of which I've actually seen, but she made plenty of things I hadn't even heard of until looking her up. Her filmography just hasn't endured the way it has for other big stars. But I guess you could say fame overall and just innovations, that kind of stuff, with UA obviously, and then her connections with her family are the biggest reasons to remember her. In addition to co-founding the studio, she was, of course, Fairbanks' wife and Douglas Fairbanks Jr.'s stepmom. A lot of S's got through it. She was even Joan Crawford's stepmother-in-law for a while because Doug Jr. was married to Crawford for about 5 years. So Mary P. is Hollywood royalty, and you certainly have to respect her business acumen. The acting bug stopped biting her about 4 years after Coquette came out, but she was still producing for another 20 years. And look at the legacy of United Artists. They were a major player in making quality movies, many of which won Oscars and/or were big hits. I believe Raging Bull and Rocky were two movies that were with UA, maybe even Cuckoo's Nest. Other big names later tried to start alliances like Chaplin, Pickford, Griffith, and Fairbanks did. Francis Coppola, Billy Friedkin, and Peter Bogdanovich's director's company only lasted a few years, though, and I think only maybe 3 movies came out of that. Frank Capra, George Stevens, and William Wyler, I think it's him, formed a company in the 40s that barely produced anything. I believe the only one of those 3 who made any movies under that flag was Capra. One of those was Wonderful Life. And Paul Newman, Barbra Streisand, and Sidney Poitier ran First Artists for about a decade during the 70s. Dustin Hoffman and Steve McQueen joined them a few years in, but even those 5 huge names couldn't keep it going for all that long. Yet UA endured. MGM eventually bought them out, but their legacy is incredible. I think it's fair to say they were one of the great studios or production companies ever. I mentioned that this is the first Mary Pickford motion picture we've ever covered. That means the only actor or actress on the AFI's top 50 stars list that we have never covered is Sophia Loren. And guess what? The odds are good I'll pick something that she was in and review that sometime soon too. I'm a completist, an anal retentive completist. Johnny Mac Brown is our man Michael. Jimmy crack corn and I don't Michael. He's best known for making westerns, most of which I haven't seen. In fact, just about everything he made seemed to be a western. He even played Billy the Kid in the 1930 version of Billy the Kid. Well, not everything he made was a western because Coquette doesn't have cowboy hats and no one is on a horsey. One of Matt Moore's red letter titles was The Unholy Three with Lon Chaney. The IMDb lists over 220 credits for him and even directed some short films. The man who plays Stanley was also Mary Pickford's brother-in-law. Before she hitched up with Fairbanks, she was married to Moore's brother Owen. So them playing love interests who kiss each other a few times in this is a mite weirder when you know those details. It's similar to Leia kissing Luke in Empire Strikes Back, except the actors weren't related, just the characters, and those two didn't know they were related, brother and sister, when she kissed him. Twice in that one movie. John St. Paulus plays Norma's dad. He worked in movies for about 30 years, starting in 1914. He had been in the Lon Chaney version of The Phantom of the Opera in 1925, then worked with the Marx Brothers, on A Night at the Opera, 6 years after his role here as the murderer-suicider. Opera. How is he not in Dario Argento's movie, Opera? Yeah, he'd been dead for over 40 years when that was made, but what kind of excuse is that? William Janney as Jimmy. He was making his debut here. He made dozens more flicks over the next 8 years, including having an uncredited role in 1931's Best Picture winner, Cimarron. That's a Western. Lots of horsies there, I believe. Louise Beavers, I love that name, had to play a lot of stereotypical maids, including in this picture, but she did have a long movie career. Yeah, there are a lot of maids on her resume, but it was Hattie McDaniel who said she'd rather play a maid than be one, and she even won an Oscar while playing one in Gone with the Wind. This was Beavers' first proper credit in a feature film. She went on to be in the Jean Harlow vehicle Bombshell, and then later on worked with Cary Grant in Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House. Their director was Sam Taylor. He was a writer and director on Harold Lloyd's classic silent comedy, Safety Last, which Bev and I reviewed last June. Taylor worked in the business for about 30 years, often teaming up with Harold Lloyd. He also did The Freshman with Harold, which I reviewed on my own on Scoring at the Movies a few years ago. That's the now defunct sports movie podcast that I ran with Chris DiGregorio for 5 years, Scoring at the Movies. Sammy T also worked with Hal Roach, and the last thing he directed was a Laurel and Hardy picture. Dude was drawn to power players and movie stars. John Gray and Alan McNeil based their script on George Abbott and Ann Preston Bridgers' 1927 play. Sam Taylor got credit for writing the dialogue. Gray joined Taylor in the writer's room when they worked on The Freshman, and he did quite a few other Harold Lloyd motion pictures. McNeil only had 2 writing credits in total. He spent most of his time in editing suites. He cut The Freshman, but the credit of his that stands out the most to me is the Oxbow Incident. Taylor and Pickford produced this zippy little melodrama. The running time is only 1 hour and 16 minutes. I actually thought I'd spend this episode ripping on the movie, but it's better than I expected, and better than advertised based on those terrible reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. The acting isn't bad at all, especially considering it was only made 2 years into the sound era. They're histrionic a lot of the time, sure, partly because of the subject matter, but anyone who prefers the over-the-top way the silent actors mugged for the camera to what Taylor got them to do in this is crazy. Maybe Pickford wasn't quite worthy of that Oscar, but she was pretty good. Heard she campaigned for it, by the way, even though it was only about 2 years into them giving, maybe only 1 year in, as in the second year of doing it. Anyway, I heard she campaigned. Anyway, she was pretty good. The guys are pretty good. I'm not in love with the picture, but I almost liked it. And I certainly don't side with those terrible Rotten Tomatoes reviews. As Mike Yanagita says in Fargo, you could do a lot worse. So that was how I saw Coquette. Mary Pickford, welcome to our channel. What's next for me in one of these solo shows will be another Oscar winner, only it won't be the Best Picture winner of 1949, All the King's Men. I said at the end of Mogambo a few weeks ago that I was going to discuss that on March 23rd, but nah. I don't feel enthused about that one, and we can always get to it some other time anyway. So it might be Sergeant York, which didn't win Best Picture, but did win a trophy for Gary Cooper and for the editor. Or it might be something else we stumble across, or that Turner Classic Movies airs between now and then. Whatever it is, it will be Oscar-related, and it will go up on this channel 2 weeks from today. But in 3 days, Bev will be here again, with this show now in the Oscars preview. We're 2 episodes into Oscar month, but we haven't actually covered a previous Best Picture winner yet. So on the 11th, we'll talk about one of the most rewarded films of all time at the Oscars, the 9-time winner, The Last Emperor. If you want to, you can get in touch with us in all sorts of ways. Emailing is one of them. We're haveyoueverseenpodcast@gmail.com. Bev is at Bev Ellis Ellis on Twix and on Threads, while I'm at MovieFiend51 on Twix, not on Threads. All our podcasts not only go up on whatever app you prefer, but we throw them up on YouTube too. The place to find our chats on YouTube is at HYES Ellis. Just our exact same podcast here if you're not listening to it there, but with a graphic there. Subscribe, and you'll always know when we post a new show. Rate us, review us, like us, do all that delightful stuff. If you enjoy what we do, then spread the word, and maybe other people will find it and make our podcast bigger and better. More popular, anyway. And help out our sponsor and help yourself by buying some beans from Sparkplug Coffee. Our HYES promo code will save you 20% off your next shipment. So it's sparkplug.coffee, and then add /HYES to work that promo code in there. And that's that for today. Thanks for tuning into this unexpected, unpromoted surprise podcast on March the 8th. Join us on Monday when we head over to China and talk about Puyi, the puppet leader, in The Last Emperor. Meantime, I'm going to keep a cool head and not resort to firing a gun at somebody, no matter how much I'm bothered that a loved one is hanging out with that somebody. And cut.